Coming up on Diplomatic Channel, South Sudan's government and the main rebel groups signed power-sharing deal. The United Nations says at least 1,500 migrants have died so far in the Mediterranean in 2018. And North Korea returns remains of 55 U.S. troops held in the Korean War. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tebito Kwefagbimi. We begin in North Africa, where South Sudan's government and the main rebel group have provisionally approved a power-sharing deal at talks in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Rebel leader and former Vice President Riek Machar, who is expected to resume his government role, was at the signing ceremony. However, smaller opposition groups did not sign the agreement. In June, the warring sides agreed on a permanent ceasefire ending 5 years of civil war. That agreement called for a transitional government to be created within 4 months that will govern for 3 years. The war in South Sudan broke out in 2013 when the country divided largely along ethnic lines. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since then. While the signing of the power-sharing deal would ordinarily have been hailed as good news, the U.S. has warned that a power-sharing agreement between President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar may sow the seeds of another circle of conflict. You'll recall that both parties signed a peace deal in 2015 that included a power-sharing agreement, but that accord quickly fell apart amid continued fighting between government and rebel forces. What then makes this new agreement different? What is the guarantee that it will work where previous ones have failed? I asked my guest on the program, African Affairs analyst Mr. Achike Chude, these questions, and here's what he had to say. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
What do you make of South Sudan's new power-sharing agreement? What makes it different from the previous one signed in 2015?
Well, I think it's a good one. Coming on the heels of what has happened there with Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and Eritrea and so on, I think we need these kinds of positive news. And of course, there was one that was signed in 2015, like you rightly said. Unfortunately, it unraveled just barely 11 months, after that. But I think this is different because all the parties that were involved in the 2015 peace agreement that did not work, I think have learned from the failures of that particular peace, agreement that did not work. And so they have taken a lot more things into consideration. Of course, it is clear that they are looking at a permanent deal. This is an agreement that is going to involve, again, both major, the protagonist and the antagonist. In this case, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, to have a power-sharing, agreement, a transitional government that will last for like about 2 years, and in the process of running the transitional government to prepare for election and all of that. And they're also going to allow peacekeepers coming to South Sudan from the African Union and the IGAD countries. These are the critical, elements. But I think that what is much more important and why this might, turn out much better than what happened in 2015 is the involvement of strategic partners in this particular, agreement. And I'm talking essentially, of Sudan. Sudan has been a very key player, even though they have been operating from behind, the scene, from the moment that South Sudan had independence. His government has been supporting some of the opposition groups, the rebel groups in South Sudan. And so it is like giving a rat some fish to eat. He has no choice than to look after that fish. And so I think it was very good of international partners, to come together and see Bashir of Sudan as a possible player in trying to resolve, the crisis, especially through this peace deal. So they have involved him in the process. That means that he has very serious influence over the group that he has been supporting all this while. So he has the ability to put pressure on them to walk the talk. Then you also have Museveni in Uganda also, that has also played a very critical role in propping up the government of Salva Kiir of Sudan. And so these are also governments outside of South Sudan itself that have been playing key roles in destabilization of South Sudan. So when you bring these people together, the power brokers, it will go a very long way in putting pressure on those who are involved in this peace process. And that is essentially why, I believe it is different. But most importantly, again, is the fact that the international community is fed up of what is going on and has promised to impose sanctions and put sanctions against the people that they see fomenting trouble in South Sudan. That includes the government, that includes Riek Machar and other people that are also involved in flaming the embers of disunity in South Sudan. So all of these things, I think, are working together and have worked together to bring about this peace deal.
Well, it seems the U.S. is not really sharing your optimism. I mean, the U.S. has warned that another power-sharing agreement between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar may sow the seeds of another cycle of conflict. Now, the U.S. says any peace process that is agreed on must include civil society, churches, women, and other excluded groups for it to be credible. Yeah. What do you say about this?
Well, you see, the reality is that this peace deal, and I share in the worries of and the reservation of the United States government. The reality is that this peace agreement, involves the two major, groups that have been responsible for the killings and the deaths in South Sudan. But that is not to say that even those other smaller rebel movements that are not exactly playing key roles today could not play key roles in future once they are able to rearm and once they are able to have access to resources and the rest. So it is very critical. There is no doubt about that. This is, a peace agreement that has bearing on the entire South Sudan, not on the government of, Salva Kiir and the movement led by, Riek Machar. It is about Sudan as a whole. And Sudan is made up of so many more components
other than
South Sudan, or made up of so many other components other than these two antagonistic forces. So you need to, I agree, you need to bring them to the table, every other one. But perhaps since these are like I said, the major combatants that have destabilized South Sudan, it is better to bring them together first, have an agreement, and then move forward towards trying to reintegrate all the other groups within South Sudan, including the churches and so on, because they all have roles to play. If you don't do that, then you would have solved one problem today and created and left room for another problem to emerge tomorrow. So I think I would agree with the United States government on this.
Now, there's something that baffles me. Initially, the South Sudan government says it was against Riek Machar rejoining the government, and there was even an announcement that he would be, repatriated to a third country for peace to reign in South Sudan. What could have motivated this sudden turnaround where the government and then Riek Machar are signing a power-sharing agreement?
Well, if Riek Machar were, was not consequential to what is going on today, he will be set aside, obviously. The reason why he's still in the mix and he has been brought back into this is because he is still a factor. Is still a very, very important factor that cannot be done away with. So you need to, sort out whatever problems he can pose to the peace process in South Sudan. And that is the only reason why he is still in the mix, because they have not been able to isolate him, in a way that makes his influence in the crisis not to wane. It has continued to be on the upswing. The crisis has continued unabatedly in South Sudan, and he is a major part of this crisis. So since they have not been able to do that, like I said, isolate him, then the best thing is to also try and work further on him to ensure that he can actually have a change of heart and begin to work in the ways that a lot of people are optimistic that if he does, then we're going to have some serious semblance of peace and stability in South Sudan. And that is why he's been brought into the mix, because he's still an important component of the peace process.
Now, like you said, we've seen repeated cycles of violence. Multiple ceasefires have been violated. The UN has accused both sides of committing abuses. Why is it so difficult to resolve this crisis in South Sudan? Why has it lingered for so long?
Well, that primordial sentiment of man, greed and all of that, and greed for economic advantage. That is what most major battles all over the world, not just Africa, are all about. The battle for resources, and with those resources, self-aggrandizement and all of those things. This particular situation in South Sudan has factored. It has brought in inputs that we did not see in the very first agreement. The key people who have also, external factors who have also been responsible in the destabilization in South Sudan have been brought into the mix. So they also have a stake. The Sudanese president, Bashir, has had issues. He has had economic issues. And so part of this agreement is that Sudan would also help South Sudan to try to rebuild the refineries that have been devastated by the conflict and so on. Of course, we know that immediately after independence, we are having South Sudan was producing about 350,000 barrels of crude oil a day. It has fallen to about 120,000 barrels. Now, Sudan itself as a country stands to gain if they can revitalize the oil industry in South Sudan. And then again, the Sudanese president is also wants to be seen as a peacemaker within his particular region. He also wants to divert attention from the political crisis and economic crisis in Sudan by playing the role of a kingmaker or a peacemaker in South Sudan. So all of these things, I think, would augur well ultimately at the end of the day towards hopefully a more peaceful, a more stable South Sudan.
Mr. Achike Chude, thank you so much for coming.
So it was a pleasure. Thank you.